Welcome everyone to another episode of the Tech Wolf podcast. And today I'm joined here with Sarah Gretczko, live in New York City for a change. So people of you who might have seen the previous episodes notice that we're in a real life setting for a change, and this is what I prefer, the human-to-human connection instead of the virtual one. Quickly on who is my guest today. Sarah is the head of talent and belonging at PayPal and has worked in the talent learning and HR strategy space for over 20 years with roles at large organizations like Deloitte, MasterCard, JP Morgan. Sarah is a future of work and behavioral insights enthusiast and has wide experience bringing innovative people strategies and solutions to some of the world's most iconic companies. And I'm fortunate enough to speak today here in the New York Times building, close to Times Square, more specifically in the Flanders House, where we before did a little tour around the Flanders House itself. So we're very grateful of Flanders Investment and Trade to host us here today. And welcome, Sarah. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
And it is a beautiful space. Excellent views.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start off this episode with the way that we've started the previous episodes too, which is a question from our previous guest. And the question is from the head of talent of Sony,
Okay.
who was very curious to hear from you how we can use current technology to appreciate the full skill set and knowledge and understanding of the individual. So we'll talk a lot about skills today in this episode, but he was wondering how can we utilize existing and future tech to consider the complete individual in a holistic sense instead of only the skills piece?
It's a great question. I think for me, one of the challenges I've always had with skills is questioning if it's at the right level of granularity. And I think what that question gets at is skills, first of all, has multiple definitions depending on who you talk to. And I think that's one of the basic problems with it as a topic. When we say skills, what do we mean? And I think to get at that question, I think you have to be really deliberate about creating the right foundation within an organization to be able to capture a number of different characteristics about an individual, skills being one of them, but again, at what level, what skills are we talking about? But I do think there's other characteristics and attributes about an individual that are equally important if you are to understand somebody's whole self and everything that they bring to the table and how they may or may not complement the other skill sets and other individuals that you have on the team. Yeah. I do think, I don't know about current technology, I do think with what we're seeing now with AI and some of the advancements that both organizations are making internally, as well as the advancements that other partners, vendors like TechWolf are making on that front, that what we're going to be able to do is going to be much greater and what we're going to be able to do on an accelerated timeline. So I'm super excited to see what that is. I don't think, though, technology alone is going to allow you to answer that question. I think there's going to be a lot of hard work that goes into thinking about how you define and design the architecture that would actually support getting to an answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So lots of attributes to consider outside of skills, in your opinion, and the technology might not be there yet to the fullest extent, but will be there soon. But still the human element remains important. It's not only
I think so. I actually think with AI, this teasing out what's so important on what we still actually need humans focused on and where they can add value. I think, unfortunately, sometimes the thrill is just, put it in the chatbot and let the thing figure it out versus really thinking about how we need to prompt whatever it is to help us come up with the solution and thinking about AI more as a partner then we're just going to be able to plug some stuff in and all of a sudden all of our greatest skills desires are going to be answered.
Yeah. It's not a plug and play.
Not a plug and play.
Solution. It's not
Yeah.
that simple.
Yeah.
And we'll come to that later because I'm very interested in the change management piece around technology too. But before we get there, let's zoom out a bit about the skills transformation in general. And maybe let's start asking you, what does the skill-based organization mean for you? And why do you think it has become so prevalent today in topics around technology, innovation, and transformation in general?
Yeah. So I actually think throughout my whole career, people have talked about skills in different ways. So I actually started my career in consulting, and it was in the days of everyone wanting to do competency models for everybody. And by the way, it gave me gainful employment for a number of years. And there were a number of different technology providers that would help you with that. And the fundamental ask there was, we really need to understand what people bring to the table so that we can get our work done. So whatever company you are, whatever industry you're in, we have work to get done, and people are a mechanism by which we can get that work done. So that, to me, honestly, is the same conversation I hear today on skills. We have work that we need to get done, and we have humans, and we need to be able to match them in some way. I think we used to use competencies as a proxy to help us do that. I think jobs in general, when you think about job architecture, that's what it's seeking to do as a proxy on how we can align people to work in the most effective manner. I think part of the reason why skills has gained so much in popularity is, number one, because of how technology is advancing and what it's allowing us to do and some of the connections it's allowing us to make. When I think of skills, I think about a data element that gives us some information about an individual that helps us understand what they may or may not be able to do. But again, I think depending on how you define skills and the level of granularity, it's still a proxy. And even when we do different types of assessments, there's certain types of things where you can have a more objective assessment for a skill, right? Like, we give when you're hiring engineers, you might give them a coding test. And that's a more objective way to really understand, do they have that skill? What it's not great at doing is really understanding that skill and application in the environment that you're in, right? So I can tell that engineer, has proficiency in a certain programming language, as an example. But when I bring that individual into the company, into a certain team environment, it doesn't actually help me really understand how that individual is going to perform. And I think there's so much energy now on this skill conversation because people are really seeking a more data-driven, objective way to answer that latter question, which is this individual really going to be able to perform? And is there a way that I can take, skills data to help me more objectively answer that question than I've ever been able to before?
Yeah. And I'm curious because you say this is a hype. There's lots of people showing an interest in skills data. You have worked for quite advanced companies in their thinking, starting with Deloitte, thought leadership on skill-based organizations, but then MasterCard too, JP Morgan, now PayPal. What has been the reason for those organizations to embark on anything skill-based? Because it's not evident that every organization does. So what were some of the triggers you've seen companies really going practical with this?
I think part of it is the advancement of technology. So it used to be that when you thought about more technical skills, that was reserved to just a population potentially within your organization. Today, we need everyone with technology skills. And I think technology skills lend themselves to be a bit more observable. I think in general, technologists love data. So I think that was a natural way for organizations to start thinking about how skills could actually be helpful, and then being able to align people to work. And then I think if you extrapolate that, you start to say, well, if we can do it for this population, it would be really helpful in general if for any role, even some of our roles that are maybe more difficult to objectively define, for us to really be able to understand how, regardless of what the work is, it's not coding, maybe it's actually a creative type of skill. How, again, can we best match people to the work? And I think and I don't think it's hype, I think where people maybe get distracted is they think the end answer is just being able to understand the skills that people possess. Mm-hmm. To me, the actual challenge is everything that comes after that. That to me is table stakes. And I think organizations today, and even some of those organizations you named, what they have realized is that in order to even be able to play the game, you have to get some of the foundational pieces right. And that means investing and embracing skills in some way. And by the way that we were looking at it at MasterCard, different than JP Morgan, different than PayPal, it has to be in the context of what that business is trying to achieve, because otherwise it just becomes a fun project, but you're not going to achieve the outcomes that you're desiring if you're not very focused on why does it matter for this company right now.
Yeah, I'm really keen to explore a little bit. How do you get started with skill initiatives? You mentioned a couple of pieces already. Having a business question in mind is important, starting with the data. But can you give concrete anecdotes of a business trigger you observed in the past, and then the opportunity you saw to tie that to a skills initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes it is really hard not to just get focused on trying to prove whatever your pilot or proof of concept is. And what I've learned going through this is it's important, to your point, to have a business outcome in mind, like why are you doing this? So when I was at MasterCard, we started playing around with skills to try to understand what the impact was going to be on the workforce, more from a future of work and thinking about, with technology coming in, how is that going to impact certain jobs in our workforce? And what does that mean, right? Are we going to have, certain roles that we have today are going to be declining in the future? We're going to need new roles created, focused with different skill sets. We just wanted to get a sense from a workforce planning perspective, how to understand the impact of technology on the people we had today and the people that we may be needed tomorrow. So we did a lot of work on that. And by the way, it yielded fascinating results, from the different populations in the workforce that were going to be more or less impacted, how quickly we thought that was going to happen. But it actually fell short of actually helping us with workforce planning. Okay. Because we looked at all of the data, and it was interesting, and we had great conversations about it, but we were a bit paralyzed in what to do with it and the actual decisions to make. And I don't actually think we made one specific decision as a direct outcome of that work. But here's what's interesting. We did all that work. And again, I was a bit disappointed, just feeling like, wow, we did all this great work. Like, we should do something with it, but not really being able to influence others to really make different decisions based on that data.
Others being the business or business
Other being business leaders, my boss. And again, everyone thought the data was interesting. So we had great conversations, but it kind of ended there. There was not okay, now what? What are we going to commit to do with this information? But what I will tell you is when the pandemic started, we as an organization needed to try to understand the work that was being done and if it could be done different places, at home, wherever. We still, we had some people that we thought still needed to be in the office. We were designated as an essential business, so we had that flexibility where if we had people that needed to come in, they were able to do that. And what we actually ended up using the data was to inform our return to office policy.
Okay.
But because we understood the work and the tasks that, and it was by job family, so we were still leveraging a more traditional construct around job architecture. But by understanding the different jobs that our people were in, we created a model, and we weighted different things. So if you were a manager of a team, that was a consideration. And then we considered that the actual task that you needed to do as an individual or collectively as a team. And that's what we used to say, here's how we think teams could work differently in the future when our default is just not everyone in the office 5 days a week. And I share that because my big learning from that was sometimes you do go, down these, different pathways, thinking you're gonna, for me, it was like our problem was workforce planning. Like that's what I wanted to solve. I thought it was excellent. I thought this was going to be a great story. We were going to be able to talk about it, show real business impact. And what I learned through that is the exploration and the experimentation is actually as important as what comes out of it. And because we had done that foundational work, when a use case that, by the way, we could have never, ever predicted would be the case, when that use case presented itself, we had learned enough and had done enough that we could resurrect that information, that data, the platform that we were using to help us solve a real business problem, which was how do we safely get people back into the office and what actually makes sense based on the work that they're doing.
That's an amazing example because we see it with lots of our customers and organizations in general that there's the sense of this is a great HR case, strategic workforce planning, for example, but then momentum stops or there's something like, there's no clear link with the business. What's next? You had the pandemic as like a very obvious trigger to start applying some of the insights you created to a real life business case. How would you advise companies to look for that use case today, and where does it sit in the project timeline, so to speak? So let's say you're an organization, 10,000 employees, and you want to start a skill-based transformation as the head of talent. What would be some of your first steps, bearing in mind that learning that you just mentioned?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important things is really understanding the business that you're in, and also expanding. So you're having conversations across the broader organization. So if you're part of a 10,000 person organization, typically by the time an organization gets that big, they're going to have organized in different ways and have different teams. I think what unfortunately can happen, and I think 10,000 honestly is an inflection point. I think there's others as companies continue to grow. But I think what tends to happen is that's where you start seeing siloed behavior, and people are just focused in their individual vertical or horizontal, depending on how it's organized, and they're not having conversations with people in other teams. My experience is sometimes the problem kind of emerges through conversations, or I shouldn't say problem, sometimes it's an opportunity, emerges through conversations on how could we actually be using this data in a different way. I was having a conversation with a business leader, and he was talking about a real challenge he was having, which was how to best integrate. And we had just at the time acquired a much smaller company, and they were bringing those individuals in, and it was not a lot of people. It was less than 100 people being brought in. But the question was, how can we, and typically for organizations that are that small, there's not a lot of infrastructure in those organizations, right? They're scrappy startups. And trying to really have an understanding of those 100 people, like who are the people that we really need to fight for to keep? Because in order for this acquisition, in order for us to meet our business case, these are the folks we need. And that was another use case that emerged on how you can use this type of data to say, who are the people? And by the way, it wasn't based on the quote unquote technical skills. I think people get very focused on, we need to, understand who has the, latest critical emerging technical skill set. A lot of times it's what we used to call the softer skills, but, more of what I would call human skills, right? The people that know how to develop relationships, that can communicate, that are curious, and want to learn. And also there's certain people that thrive in, 100-person organizations that don't thrive in 10,000-person organizations. And I think really getting an understanding of all of those things, it kind of goes back to the question you asked me at the beginning.
First,
like understanding that holistic view, because we don't come as pieces of ourselves, right? Like my arm doesn't show up one day to work and then my leg. Like you got to take all of me, right? All of the good, the bad, like I bring everything every day. And so I think what tends to happen is when we just get focused on just talking about skills, we forget that it's part of a system. And these organizations are systems, and they're very different, by the way, for anyone that's worked at different companies. I mean, at the minute you step in, cultures are different, ways of working are different, norms are different, rituals are different. And that stuff actually matters in, I think, application of skill and what you're actually able to achieve collectively with a collection of individuals that possess different skill sets.
Yeah, okay. We talked about the organization and different stakeholders to manage in order to get something going. Often there's also the question within HR, who owns the skills piece? And I see you laugh a little bit, but you've been in learning roles, you've been in talent roles, you've been in HR strategy, so you've seen maybe close to or the full extent of the end-to-end employee life cycle. Where would you say a skills project lands best in HR or should sit with which function in HR? If there is any preferred function.
So I laugh, Julius, because I feel like I have this conversation a lot with other folks in organizations that have roles similar to mine. Actually, someone who was on your podcast, Sandra, from EPAM, I've spent some time with her, and I remember sitting at her at a dinner, and we were having this debate around, or it wasn't really a debate, but it was this realization that a lot of times the needs for skills sit with the business. So in some ways, that should be owned by the business, right? They own the business problem, they own the outcome. The challenge, especially as you get to organizations as they grow, is you don't want all these business leaders doing different things and partnering with different, external providers to support them in a certain way. So what tends to happen is that then becomes a push towards centralizing the ownership. And so a lot of times that'll be within an HR function. Because skills a lot of times, right, people think about it from a hiring perspective, from a learning and development perspective, and that tends to be within the remit of an HR or people function. What I have realized is that's actually the wrong question, because I actually think there's different pieces that should be owned by different individuals when it comes to skills. I think the business problem or the opportunity absolutely sits with the business. I think setting the architecture and infrastructure in order to be able to use skills to help you make strategic choices for those business problems or opportunities actually should sit centrally. Because I think you're therefore more effective across the board. You don't have all people talking, about skills using different languages, defining skills in different ways. There is value in driving consistency across the board, especially when you think about that. I think of all the organizations I've ever worked at, even people who are quote unquote individual contributors, they work as part of a team. They're contributing to something collectively greater than just the work that they're doing. And in order for us to think about how we can harness the collective potential of a workforce, you need to have common language. You need to have common principles. you need to have a shared philosophy around even how we think about skills. And so I actually think it's shared ownership, depending on what exactly we're talking about. And where you actually find the power is when you get that partnership. So in my experience, where I feel that we've actually made progress was that partnership. The example I gave you with COVID, it was obviously folks from my team that had done some of the data. We had facilities individuals that were involved. We had business leaders from our management committee that were involved, and it was collectively coming together to solve a enterprise-wide problem. But all of these different groups brought different things to the table, and then we just had to be clear on roles and responsibilities.
Yeah.
And I think if you do that, then you set yourself up to be able to make progress versus just having because you can spin on that question, where does it land? And then it lands, and then everyone else is looking at those people to like, okay, tell us when you're done, and then hand me the thing when it's complete. Versus it is about the experimentation and the iteration, and working together to solve something. And what I've realized too is nobody has this figured out.
No, yeah, it's true. That's why we're having conversations like these, to try and look for people who have, to some extent. Yeah. But it's very interesting to hear, and I think a lot of it also comes from, it's very clear you can do a lot with skills, but what do you do first? And several functions might be incentivized to push their agenda first over others. So let's say you're in a company and there's a learning function, there's talent function, there's a HR operations function, and all of them have fantastic skills use cases. How do you decide which one you take on first? And that's often the challenge that we see with organizations. So yeah.
I think it is the challenge. I will tell you, and again, this is just from my lived experience, I will always try to go for where there's energy and passion and a business leader that has a real business problem to solve as where to start. Because I think showing progress, it just matters. And I think sometimes where skills efforts get either paused, stopped, slowed down, is where there's just not that focus, and it feels like it's just a project to be done. It's like, okay, let's just get a quote unquote skills taxonomy, check it off, and then move on to the other thing. So for me, it's always been about who are the right partners to help drive whatever skills initiative it is, and bringing all the parties to the table early on. That's another big learning I have is, sometimes, especially if it's driven, from the learning team or some team in HR, a lot of times they get so far down a path, they may have even decided on a partner to, or a vendor to partner with, and then they start talking to, their partners, on the tech side or in the business that all need to be part of that. And for them, they're not part of it.
No, yeah.
Right? They're coming in, it feels like the 11th hour. They didn't have input or influence into some of those decisions, and they don't feel like it's theirs. So I think, and especially because we don't have it all figured out, and there's no easy answers, right? It's not go put this platform in, or, just get your skills taxonomy and you're going to be done. And because of that, it does require a lot of conversation, thinking about how do you start? Where do you start? And having the right people in that conversation. And by the way, there's no right answer. For some organizations, it may be we want to do something broader with a big, broad population. Just to, as an example, provide transparency for people. I think one of the greatest use cases that is underlooked is the value that understanding skills that the different types of work that you do at your organization need, and the people that are in those roles to just understand, for me to be able to do this successfully, these are the skills that they're saying are important.
Career path.
And just that transparency for the individual to say, or I look at, I'm like, oh, Julius, I really want his job. Like, I want his job one day. And then I look at the skills and I'm like, oh, I'm not sure I have all those. It's an amazing conversation for an individual. It's amazing knowledge for an individual to have so that when they have conversations with, whether it's their direct manager, whether it's a mentor, whoever it is, it gives them something tangible to talk about versus, I just really want to get promoted.
Yeah,
I want to get to that level, or I just want that job because I've been in my role for a while and I want something different. I think the value that it gives people in that, just that knowledge around expectation is so powerful, and I don't think we're taking advantage of it enough.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. And I also want to double click on some of those use cases, because we often hear when we ask companies, let's say you have all the skills data in the world, what's one of the first things you would do with that data? And often the question is internal mobility or upon reskilling. Can I ask you, starting with internal mobility, how would you challenge somebody giving that response to dig deeper into making that use case more concrete?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I think it is very easy to talk at a certain level about things and say, we're going to use skills for hiring. What does that mean? So in your example for internal mobility, I would ask the question, why? Why? And keep asking yourself that question, like, what exactly is it that skills are going to help you do, solve, whatever it is, and keep asking yourself that question to test out, is this actually, number one, a use case that's actually going to have the outcome or impact that I'm desiring, but also for yourself to get very clear on the problem you're trying to solve. And by the way, leaders in organizations, I feel like this is my job every day, is to think about the problems that are worth solving and the problems that aren't. There's always going to be tons of problems. And some of the challenges of being a leader is choosing which of those to actually go after. And I think what happens in skills is when you think about the potential that you could do with that type of information, it's very easy to want to do it all.
Yeah.
And therefore, you almost don't know where to start because you just want to do it all. So my first piece of advice would be very focused on the problem you're trying to solve and why.
And when are you satisfied with that answer? So let's say you ask why, and they give you an answer, and you keep asking why. When do you stop and you're like, oh, this is deep enough, now we can get started with this?
I think when you feel like enough of the noise is out of the way from going through that process, and what you actually have left is exactly why it matters. So one of my favorite books is by Nate Silver, The Signal and the Noise. And I actually think it's a really good analogy for everything that's going on in the skills space, which is there's a lot of noise. Even what do we mean when we say skills, right? Even the term itself, there's a lot of noise. And I think when you can filter through that and really understand what are the signals that matter. And again, I don't think it's one answer for everybody. I think it depends on the company that you're in, the moment that they're in, what the problems or opportunities that are there before you. And that's what you have to be really thoughtful about, because otherwise you're going to go off on probably a lot of different efforts that are following noise and aren't going to actually, number one, even progress you. Because like I said, when I gave you one of the examples, sometimes you end up doing a effort, initiative, or project doesn't yield what you thought it would. It doesn't mean that that was a waste of time. So I'm always for keep asking yourself that question, keep kind of questioning that. And even when you're in the middle of it, and I haven't done this through all those examples, and one of my biggest learnings was the importance of the zoom out and the pause to say, okay, where are we? What have we found out? Based on what we know today, that, by the way, we might not have known when we first started this, should we be doing anything differently? Should we be continuing? Should we be just stopping now because this is actually, we've learned something that's telling us maybe this isn't the direction we should be going? I think what happens with projects, initiatives, et cetera, you want to get to the end. You're very focused on the end, and you don't always take those breaks to say, does it make sense to continue? Or should we, go down a different path and explore something different with the new knowledge that we got through what we've done to this point?
Yeah, awesome. There's also a lot of decisions around going externally for support. And we're right now in an HR tech market where they definitely capture the buzz around skills, let's say. But for some folks, and maybe yourself too, who have gone to technology conferences, you might leave more confused than you leave educated. Yeah. So in your years in previous organizations and currently at PayPal, how did you go outside to look at vendors, and how did you enter these conferences or these opportunities to meet with new innovative companies that might potentially be able to support you in your journey? What was your mindset going in there?
Yeah. So my mindset is typically not to go after a specific technology partner or vendor. I have actually found the most value in just having conversations that aren't actually linked to a certain piece of work that I want help with, but really just a conversation about the topic to see just what people's thoughts are on that topic. Usually with that, you can really understand the depth or not they might have had. And then I think it's continuing to have those conversations until you build certain relationships and trust. That for me is always more important than, just going out and doing a, request for information or request for a proposal for a specific piece of work. Because a lot of times what I want to do is refined through those conversations. And so if I were, to go to a tech conference tomorrow, I would much more just focus on conversations with people around the topic than supporting me with specific requirements. I also find a lot of value in what other people in my role at other companies are doing. What they've, especially for folks that I feel like might be a little bit ahead, what they've learned, what has worked, what hasn't. I think that practitioner sharing is so powerful, and I don't think we do enough of it. I think sometimes we assume that all these vendors that, you're right, are out there proliferating the market, and not even, skills only vendor, right? These are vendors that are probably even providing other services at your organization now that see that there's an opportunity and want to get in there. And I think the most important thing is to lead with making sure you're having conversations with people externally, not necessarily vendors, but like I said, other practitioners that are in the space, that you are taking advantage when, somebody's speaking on something and you can hear the conversation. I always actually love when you can hear the conversation between different vendors, having different vendors answer the same question on the topic, because I think it gives you a glimpse into how they are approaching it. But the reality is, no vendor is going to be the perfect partner for everything that you want to do. So I always look for partners who are willing to challenge what I want to do, push back on me, but also be creative about how I can approach the problem that I'm trying to solve within the constraints that I have. Because unfortunately, the budget is always limited, resources, capacity, all that stuff is always limited. And for me, an external partner who can really help you navigate that. And by the way, even some of that sharing what they've seen work at other places, not that it, definitely will work with you, but giving you that insight into how others are approaching it, I think is the most valuable thing that some of these external partners provide, not necessarily the technology.
Yeah, it's about trust, it's about knowledge, the people behind the tech, not just the features. And just having conversations with people. Yeah. Okay, sounds good. We talked about getting started. We talked about technology vendors.
Yep.
Let's say you have all that in place and your journey kicks off. How important is, of course, you're going to say it's very important, but change management?
Not important at all.
Okay, next question. No, but to keep the momentum going, what are some of your practical tips and tricks or learnings, challenges, hurdles that you've come across in keeping an innovative project going? Because often there's excitement at the kickoff, but then how do you avoid it fades out?
Yeah, I always tell people this whenever we talk about piloting, because my experience with pilots is pilots always work beautifully. Because to your point, there's excitement, there's energy, and then you do the pilot and everyone's excited, and then you go to scale it and it's like, what happened?
Yeah.
Exactly. Like there was so much beautiful stuff here, and then it doesn't seem to continue on. I think from a change management perspective, and this is not just about skills, I think in general, the most important thing is always about mindset. And I think that's what sometimes these efforts get wrong, because they can be so focused on just the content, the data, the technology, oh, we brought this cool platform in and look what it can do. And like a lot of times it does look very cool. Yeah. And you play around with it.
It's very engaging
It's
for the
very
business
engaging.
too, right?
Oh my gosh. And you're like, oh, this is like amazing. But when you haven't really focused on evolving or even changing the mindset within the organization, it doesn't matter, how great a platform is, how great your content is, how reliable, credible, all that kind of stuff, because people aren't actually bought into what you're trying to do and why you're doing it. And I think where we run into the problem on the skills front is back to what I was saying earlier. I think a lot of times people are skeptical because they're like, well, why do you want to know that information? How are you going to use that information? And is that actually going to be good for me or not? Now, some of that has to do with trust that employees do not have with their organization. But I think some of it is we haven't been clear with people. And, we're in an environment now where people are very concerned about their data. And not just, employee data, but any of our data, right? Like you think about, as a consumer. And, we always joke like, oh my gosh, is Facebook listening to me? Now I see all these ads coming up. So there's already, people are skeptical about how their data is being used, with or without their permission in ways that they may or may not agree with. And I think skills, it starts to get at that because we realize the power is in linking skills to individuals to really understand what individuals bring to the table. And that can be scary for some people that don't understand how is that a benefit to me? Now, to go back to your use case around internal mobility, if I understand that skills is actually going to allow me, number one, to really understand the different career pathways I may have, that, by the way, before were either invisible or I actually didn't even understand that maybe I possessed a skill set that could take me in a different way. That's super powerful, right? Because you're putting that power and knowledge in the hands of individuals. And that transparency alone, I think, goes a long way for people feeling like organizations are invested in their career. And then from a business perspective, to be able to use that information to better link people with the right type of work is obviously super powerful. But I think we also sometimes over-rotate on the skills to individuals use case within why you would want to become a skills-powered organization, and don't think as much about how you look collectively as people, as a team. And I think actually sports is a great way to think about this. Like if you think about, a sports team, we just had the Super Bowl here in the U.S. And if you think about a football team, there's different roles. People play different roles. They have different skill sets, right, on that football team. Like you don't need a dozen quarterbacks. You just don't. And so really understanding the different skill sets that people have and how you need to bring skill sets together to be able to accomplish work collectively, I actually think is the real unlock. And I think we get caught up in the just understanding skills as an individual, and we're so focused on that we're not actually thinking about what is the problem we're trying to solve.
What is the work needing to be done?
What is the work? Yeah. And like I said, even if you're an individual contributor at an organization, I know not one individual contributor that is not doing work that's for the benefit of a team.
It's never really individual, right?
It's never really individual.
It's always connected.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We kind of went through not the full journey, but a large part of it. And you've distilled some loose pieces of advice to it. But as we wrap up, what would be a key piece of advice you would leave organizations with, and specifically organizations that are skills curious? Mm-hmm. So maybe not yet the resources, maybe not yet the business momentum to get started, but that are willing to. What would you advise them, having talked about what we talked before, just as a distillation?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is continuing to be curious and learn. I think this space is changing. I think it has changed incredibly. I mean, even if I think about where we were right before COVID and where we are now, in that short amount of time, I think the conversation has shifted. What people are doing has really evolved and accelerated. So my advice would be, even if you're not going to put any investment of time or people, just to continue listening to podcasts like this to hear stories, reading. I'm reading a book now called The Skills Code, and it's pulling together these different pieces of information that's going to help you as a practitioner really understand maybe what the opportunity, or not, by the way, because I also think it's okay for people to be in a spot where they say, now's not the right time because we need to actually focus somewhere else. And yes, skills are important and we want to understand them, but I'm not going to prioritize that problem today. That's a tomorrow problem, not a today problem. And again, I think that's okay as long as you're continuing to learn and understand, and from what others have done. And by the way, it's actually kind of great not always to be in the front, because then you get the benefit of not having to repeat mistakes that others have made. Yeah. So really being able to understand, okay, well, I'm definitely not going to start here. Enough organizations have done this, and we've learned, this information. That's actually a really powerful position to be in. Mm-hmm. But I think you have to learn, you have to be curious, you have to be looking for different mediums that's going to get you that knowledge, so that you're not just waiting for somebody to hand you the right solution.
Yeah, and on that note, what are the top 3 companies you look up to in terms of the way they're headed with skills, would you say? And you can't say MasterCard, JP Morgan, or Deloitte.
Darn it. I'll caveat this by saying I don't think people have this figured out.
Yeah.
So I think there's a ton of opportunity. I personally think, from conversations I've had, that the work that Sandra's doing at EPAM Systems is really interesting. Again, it's a very specific environment, workforce, but I think how they're thinking about it and the link to business outcomes is very, very strong. I do think some of the tech companies, so Google and Apple, we were talking about Meta, Facebook, I think because of the nature of just how their companies have evolved, there's some interesting things there that they're able to do that accelerates a bit what some other organizations can do. And then I'm not going to name a company for the last one, but I will name an industry. I actually think pharmaceuticals is doing some interesting work in the skills space. And again, a very particular environment and types of skills that you're talking about. But I think there's some good learnings that folks in that industry are doing as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Before we get to the next question you're going to ask to the next guest, which actually most likely will be in the pharma industry. So
Oh,
skills
nice.
professional
Okay.
in the pharma industry.
I
So
love it.
think about that one.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to try out a lightning round with you. So just
Okay.
a quick fire of questions. And I have 5 of them. First one, what's an outdated HR practice that needs to die?
Reference checks.
Reference checks, okay. If you had to bet on one emerging skill being critical in 2030, what would it be?
Patience.
Okay. What's the biggest myth about skill-based organizations?
That technology is going to be the solution.
The silver bullet solution,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. And I'll keep it at 4. If you had to describe the future of work in one word, what would it be?
Human.
Human. Love that. That was ready.
I've
Awesome.
been asked that one before.
Oh, really? Okay, cool. And then to close off,
Yeah.
we have a next guest that I'm speaking with the day after tomorrow.
Okay.
What do you want to ask them about? It can be about skills, it can be about anything else, something you're curious about.
Yeah. So back to this, what we were talking about earlier around skills and noise. My question to your next guest would be, what if we have it wrong? What if the focus on skills is wrong? What if this is the next performance ratings? And we're putting a lot of time and energy, and it's actually the wrong thing to focus on. What might we be overlooking that would be a better use of our time than focusing on skills-based organizations?
Let's see how they roll with that.
Can't wait.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sarah, for the conversation here, and I hope we do this again.
Thank you so much for having me.